Hey guys, this is a very quick upload. I thought I just had to get out because it's just so relevant and important for all of us living in the US right now. Like, I get people are afraid, rightfully so, with all that's been happening, and meanwhile, I'm just pissed. And so I'm hoping what I've been working on will be at least a little help slash inspiration, hopefully, especially on the topic of anxiety becoming our strength to resist. Also, heads up, this is just a small section, like already an hour into a nearly 4-hour video on how Metaphor's music reveals everything about its world building lore and themes. So some things might sound a bit under elaborated on because background context or concepts were covered earlier or in some other part of the video. This is also the least amount of actual analysis I do when it comes to the OSTs themselves selected here. So, in other words, I dive much deeper musically into the location themes and significant battle themes in other sections, so I hope that's something you can look forward to. But without further ado, I'd like to discuss the track Hero's Awakening and its relationship with anxiety, Magla, Utopia, and everyday heroism. This theme is Meguro's version of a fanfare, and straight up one of the tracks that stood out to me the most in Metaphor's trailers because normally this type of music is written for and played by brass because we easily project out in the open the best. So color me intrigued that strings were the prominent voice here. The 58-second mark gives a more typical, solely brass version of the same melody, and I have more to say about the significance of this instrumentation soon. But first, the most basic definition of a fanfare is that it's a brief, energetic line that's attention-grabbing. It signals the arrival of someone or something significant. So, like, it was mostly reserved for military or royalty or state officials in the past. As for what exactly makes it sound energetic, aside from the forte or loud dynamic, well, the quicker tempo for sure when contrasted with the slower track that precedes it in-game. Fanfares are celebratory in nature, and it's perfectly used to announce the moment each one of the party members awakens their archetype, especially given how much Moore loves describing the archetype as a heroic power. The key signature was perfectly selected as well, being scored in D major, or well, the most relevant part for my analysis and focal point of this piece is, and this key was thought of as the key of triumph, hallelujahs and war cries of victory rejoicing. Many final triumphant movements in real-life symphonies are scored in D major, such as Beethoven's Ninth and Mendelssohn's Fifth. And this brings me back to one of the dev interviews I quoted way earlier in this video. Remember what Hashino said about the game's central theme of anxiety? How whenever a person awakens to the archetype, it's not like it was some kind of grand, predetermined destiny, but because of the interactions with other people and finding inspiration in the actions of others. Solidarity breeds courage. We take inspiration from each other when we stand together, side by side. There will always be those rare few who are courageous and overcome their anxieties by their own accord. People like the Protag or Stroll. and they travel around the country meeting up with others who also overcome their own fears and unlock their own archetypes. When those who have that natural disposition band together, it inspires more and more people to be courageous, and the movement grows. Eventually, there's enough collective belief to power the MC, the people's number one choice, up and over Luis for good. Fun fact, if you check the popularity rank in the academia after the Moore fight, the protag is already at number 1. But on that note, let's talk about anxiety and catastrophizing. Those who are unable to overcome their anxiety turn into these grotesque monsters called humans. All in Uchronia are capable of becoming one when they don't take responsibility for their own fears and end up taking it out on others, especially via unfairly scapegoating. Now, to turn to the first form of Luis we fight, I argue that this is his own archetype, the symbolic power of him having overcome whatever fears he might have. And speaking of, you might think Luis doesn't have any, but even a headstrong person like him does. He finally succumbs to the fear that he can't meet his own ideology of individual responsibility once he sees that not only has the protag essentially come back from the dead, but that all the party survived insurmountable odds. Perhaps he alone isn't enough to defeat them, and that's when he becomes a human. Sure, he might have more sentience than other humans, but he becomes one nevertheless. So yes, true solidarity, like the main parties, helps combat the hold of existential dread, one of the most important points of metaphor. Yes, we as individuals need to take responsibility for our own personal fears, but it doesn't mean we have to do it alone. It's the emotional support and mutual aid of people around us that mitigates the harms of anxiety. So let's take the followers. Don't think for a moment that they were not gripped by their own dread. We clearly see that as all their ranks progress, and most of them have been burned in the past by other people and/or by terrible circumstances. And so it obviously becomes scary to place faith in others or even have hope that things could get better. But eventually, they choose to try and trust again. It's everyday people like Brigida, Maria, and Barden who are the kind of heroic tales that the opening acts of this game say the people have forgotten about, largely because history isn't taught and even tampered with by self-serving elites. All of Forden's schemes, anyone? This is all the more relevant over the past couple real-life years as religious nationalists and now the current regime attack universities and institutions of learning. And I will return to this topic later, but I also want to shout out my video on Rella and the dangers of Christian nationalism. You can find up in the cards or the description. But yeah, the followers are all deserving of this fanfare track as well, even if it doesn't actually play for them. The courage to believe that a better future is still possible if we work at it. Take Katerina. She finds that much of her bounty work paid off in a way she never expected before. Now she has all these connections to people who are creating jobs for Parapus, with these workers themselves going off to recruit others like them. And I get that ideally it'll go even farther to having collective ownership of the company, but even if not perfect, I just really appreciate Metaphor for being such a blatant breath of fresh air from the hyper-individualism that's gripped the US in particular for decades now. Maria and Barden are another showcase of mutual aid and civic engagement. First, in regards to Barden, yes, the initial reactionary surveillance is a huge misstep and is pretty scary given what we're dealing with now with databases like the one Palantir is building. But I like the final message here, how the townspeople recognize they also bear responsibility for their town, that it was unfair of them to place the entire well-being of Martyra purely on Bardens or whoever would lead them next shoulders. It all further supports one of the core messages of Metaphor ReFantazio, that we should not heap all our collective anxieties onto singular people. As for Maria's final rank, the first reason it's so goated is it shows how easy it is for anyone to fall on hard times and become homeless under this current system. One horrible myth perpetuated is that this population is lazy, so they deserve it, that they don't want to work, even though the majority do just to survive. They just don't earn a wage that can put a roof over their head. With that said, it's this former small business owner who encapsulates how a person who was once successful can become impoverished in this exploitative system. Like, it's so blatantly obvious given the real-life tariffs right now that so many small businesses are getting crushed through no fault of their own. Anyway, I personally believe there's always something you can do to look out for your fellow neighbors, and the Honeybee Inn had the means to establish a soup kitchen-like program, one that's universal and is not means-tested. In other words, doesn't force someone to prove they need help or deserve it. Until the day arrives when policy provides for the hungry and destitute, we can look out for each other in our own ways instead of just letting suffering go by unaddressed. It takes all of us to make societies function well, so returning to the fanfare analysis, this is why the strings and brass together are so significant. It takes more than just the brass, and also makes the overall sound so much more grand because the texture of all the different kinds of instrumental sounds makes everything literally fuller. On this note, I think the average person, at least in the US, is sadly unaware of our own history and just how much the rights we take for granted now took the hard-fought efforts of grassroots-led movements of the past. Again, it's these kinds of people who became volunteers, activists, and organizers who are the real heroes because those in power never give the oppressed rights and freedoms willingly. It takes the people to fight for them. Freedom of and from religion, the abolishment of slavery, the women's right to vote, working class rights. Like, yeah, I get the 5-day work week sucks now, and a lot of people sadly work way more hours than 8 a day, but it used to be way more dangerous where people were getting permanently maimed and dying all the time before striking workers fought for better working conditions. There's a reason for the saying, regulations are written in blood. Either people died or were severely injured on the job, and in the fight for securing rights as well. So many old school strikes and marches became horrifically violent via police brutality. People died. But many of these human rights movements ultimately wouldn't have gotten anywhere without solidarity among various identities. Some that you might not know about are, for one, the successful Oxnard beach strike in 1903, which took a coalition of Japanese and Mexican American farmers. And the Black Panthers were a huge factor in the successful sit-in for disability rights and eventual ADA law, the American Disability Act of 1990. They consistently cooked and brought food to the protesters so they wouldn't have to leave the building and could continue the sit-in, which ultimately lasted 26 days straight, something that simply couldn't have sustained itself as long as it did if it wasn't for mutual aid and solidarity. We embellish and take inspiration from heroes of the past, none who were perfect, by the way. Meanwhile, the everyday heroes of today will become the heroes of future tales. Uchronia being our world in the far future means legit us, the player, as acknowledged in the credits, is an example of this greater metaphor. Moore and the protagonist took inspiration from us, someone who existed all those years ago. And now, future Ukrainian people will take inspiration from the cast in this tale. Metaphor isn't only romanticizing the history of Ukrainia, it quite clearly critiques and shows how horrible things were and still are, but it also acknowledges the everyday heroes that chose to do something about it. Many of the scenic spots along the journey show us that while we can be inspired by these tales and our past history, we must also never turn our eyes away nor forget about the atrocities that were perpetuated in these locations. It's easy to view all these old historical events as fantasy since we're so far removed from those events. Much like how all of us today can hardly fathom what it was like living a millennia ago where there were no modern amenities like a working toilet. This brings me to how romanticizing things does have a negative connotation. One major facet of it is distorting the truth in some way, and I will elaborate more on this when I get to the Forden and Luis section after Grand Trad. But if you kind of boil this romanticization down to its very core or basic component, it's basically just idealizing things in the past. It's a tool that can look really different depending on how it's used. Much like how Luis and the protag read the same fantasy book, but one chooses to plunge the world into chaos while the other refuses to give up on a better future for all people. So remember I bookmarked this topic last section? So interestingly enough, the cat in the academia is named Plateau, which is perhaps a cheeky way to refer to Plato, because alongside More's Utopia, Plato's penned work, The Republic, would fit in very well here. The latter in particular having had a great influence on Western political philosophy. More himself would have been very familiar with this work given his training in the classics. Or in other words, he was trained in this kind of pedagogy and used many rhetorical arguments that played off Plato's time. In fact, More is emulating the Republic's writing style given how both are written as an open dialogue between characters in order to advance their points. And overall, both the Republic and Utopia have to do with what constitutes an equitable and just society. And this ties to the wider metaphor of utopia as a concept. True perfection is impossible, and similarly, these books have great ideas when juxtaposed to the norms of their time, but they definitely wouldn't be considered great or perfect by today's standards. This is related to what's called the Overton window, or the window of discourse, as in the range of subjects deemed politically acceptable to the mainstream public at any given time. So, protests that don't seem like they gain much de facto wins can still be ultimately successful in that they've shifted the Overton window. You see, the final chapter of the fantasy book is the revolution eventually devolving. Gallica and the protag talk about how even those people failed in the end. They were never able to achieve a truly perfect society, a utopia. So Gallica and protag could have easily thought, well, who's to say we'll be any better? In fact, even if we do win the throne, we're not gonna be perfect, so we might as well not even try and just give up now. The doomer mentality is tempting. An easy way to put your head down, stop trying, and not think anymore. This brings me to the track that always plays before the Archetype Awakening fanfare. Determination's denouement is scored in G minor, which was generally characterized as discontent, uneasiness, and I kid you not, worry over a failed scheme. Sound doomer much? So from the 118 timestamp, especially from 122 onwards to the end of the loop at 147, it gets pretty dark. Starts emphasizing only minor chords and introduces the lowest of the low brass. The tuba enters and continuously holds the root note. And then later, the bass trombones join it in echoing the melody at moments like 134. This is how the loop ends. So basically a literally low mood. Mozart himself composed a lot in G minor and considered it the best to express sadness and tragedy, so this basically ends asking, well, should we just let it end this way? With that said, I appreciate that metaphor ReFantazio acknowledges that the good guys don't always win, you know? In the case of the game's direct narrative, we did, but take some of the vistas along the journey where atrocities occurred. We can even look at the contrast of the protag versus his own father, the former king, the latter who had great ideals himself but was unable to execute them. Yet as long as the good guys keep trying, then those who tried before didn't die in vain. The king and the Elden Queen's magic, even Grius, none of their actions were futile, because others with the same cause took up the mantle and continued the fight for them. And so, the Hero's Awakening fanfare sounds all the more heroic because it's coming off the previous track's grim ending. The violin's higher register and the string sound in general are a nice textural contrast to all the heavy low brass leading up to it. Okay, actually, I do recognize that the game itself sold the relationship between these two tracks short. I wish the full pre-awakening music was allowed to play all the way out, because oftentimes we don't even get to the very important, darker part of the loop. But if you listen to these two tracks back to back as was probably intended, they present the perfect question of either accept fantasy is dead or continue to believe it's real. We overcome our dread and gain the power to resist. You see, resistance and change often begins in art, and very often in the art of words. Think of all the pamphlets and booklets that inspired people to think something else was possible. We already mentioned Thomas More and Plato, but there's also those like Locke, Voltaire, Spinoza, and too many others to name. So going up against the current existing power easily seems impossible. But so did the divine right of kings or the oppression of state religion way back when. And let's just say there's a whole lot more of us who are more or less in the peasant class nowadays compared to the billionaires. Just saying. Also, I hope this is encouraging to you guys. According to the researchers and academics of these historical movements, just 3.5% of a population showing up to protest have resulted in political change, including holding back authoritarian movements. In-game Moore himself, author of the fantasy novel, says early on just how important the collective is when he says, "A hero standing alone is no hero at all, but a simple dissenter. Without the support of others, their ideals are soon buried." We are all rightfully scared and anxious right now as the US is this close to being under martial law. But remember, courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important. And no, I'm not being alarmist. We're already so far into this horribly illegal and cruel regime. Please don't be the denizens of Virga Island as we first encountered them, willfully blinding themselves to the reality facing them. Now is not the time to back down. Appeasement never works against fascists, so now more than ever, we need to show up in solidarity and resist this tyranny together. I want to believe. I'm gonna extend the benefit of the doubt that enough of us don't want to live in a totalitarian state, that we don't want to be remembered as fascists. My grandfather and great-uncles fought the fascists in World War II, and I'm sure many of yours did too. So if you'd like to turn your anxiety into action, I've included both big and smaller local ways you can get involved and resist down in the description. Everything helps and everyone according to their ability. Trust me, I get it. I'm disabled and have been at this kind of thing for over a decade. But truly, if you are able, come join the mass nationwide No Kings protest on Saturday, June 14th, just a couple days from now. Locations are all over the country. You can find one with the link below. Believe me, you'll feel better among people who you know share your belief in fantasy. That something better than this current moment is on the horizon if we try together. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Please share if you think it'll help someone. And finally, I really need to thank all my wonderful patrons and channel members for making these videos possible, especially my special fusion supporters: Big Klingy, Sam Bezjak, M. Yanolin, Malcolm Lowry, Peter Shepard, Andy, Jimmy Tapiz, Frank Sasaki, Phoenix Black, and Weeping Blade.